His was the only boat to arrive.
I think maybe it was a cow. I don't know.
There's the thank you letter from Lyndon Johnson.
There was even a monorail at one point to the east of us.
Plus, everybody forgets about pirates.
This is the coolest field trip I have ever been on.
I don't know, but I've been told, keep on dancing, won't ever get old.
Hello and welcome to the Long Island History Project, the podcast that brings you stories and interviews with people passionate about Long Island history. You can hear them all at longislandhistoryproject.org. My name is Chris Kretz. I am your host, and our opening music was courtesy of the Homegrown String Band. Today we're taking as our starting point one of the most iconic historic events in Long Island history. That's the hurricane of 1938. But we're not interested in the storm so much as what happened after. We're talking disaster relief, the Red Cross, the New Deal, down trees and ruined churches, all with today's very special guest.
My name is Dr. Jonathan C. Bergman. I have both a JD and a PhD from Thoreau University and from the University of Buffalo. I got my graduate degree in American history, served as an instructor at University of Buffalo, and as an assistant professor of history at Texas A&M University Commerce. And since then, I've been doing some editing. I served as a news editor of an online car magazine, and I do part-time academic editing as well right now.
And first of all, Jonathan, thank you. Welcome, and thanks for coming to talk today. We're in the basement of the Sayville Library, so we'll thank them for hooking us up. We're taking you back 12 years to your dissertation, The Shape of Disaster and the Universe of Relief, A Social History of Disaster Relief in the Hurricane of 38, Suffolk County, Long Island, New York, 1938 to 41. So there's a lot to unpack there. But if you close your eyes and think back to your dissertation, what memories spring to mind?
Well, it was interesting. Of course, when you're in graduate school, it's always a little exciting and there's a little bit of anxiety in what topic am I going to pick. At first, I had designs, going into graduate school pretty much in the shadow of 9/11. I was going to do a history of American terrorism, from its origins to fast forward. And then when a course came around in my later graduate years, you had to go off do original research and write a paper that might have been suitable for an academic journal. And I thought, here I am in Buffalo, but born and raised on Long Island and growing up at Water's Edge on Seaford, recognizing the power and dynamism that occurred right at that interface between people and the environment. And I looked into the hurricane of 38. And I had actually been walking the streets during Hurricane Gloria, and I remember that vividly. And as I researched it more, I just focused in on the New Deal aspect. And that paper was called A New Deal for Disaster, which became a chapter in the manuscript. And I said, I like this. I like that there's not much literature out there that has to do with disaster. As a matter of fact, a lot of my professors were worried that I'd be pigeonholed as the odds and ends professor. I think some of it had to do with my professors being genuinely concerned with, they didn't want me to pick a topic that was a dog, and others just didn't think it had any value. Luckily, I had sort of one of the wild cards in SUNY Buffalo History Department, Michael Frisch, and he took me under his wing, and I got to work on it. No sooner did I go out to start to do research than Hurricane Katrina struck. And then we had a big hurricane in China, I think it was Nargis, and an earthquake in Pakistan. Then as I was off, had my first professor job, then Hurricane Sandy happened on Long Island, and that created a lot of buzz. But I remember after Katrina, a lot of my professors were like, Jonathan, maybe you're onto something here.
One thing that I had never thought of, you kind of go through a roll call of disasters from early America, the early days going back to the 1700s. Can you say a little bit about what was disaster relief in the early American Republic before we get into the 30s?
Okay, well, this is looking at more the national, federal level. These are sort of large-scale relief actors. And prior to the 20th century, you would have, it was, prototypically the frontier settler through his own pluck and ingenuity, rebuilding his house that was suddenly succumbed to a fire. Or Matthew Mulcahy wrote a book on colonial Caribbean schemes about how planters would reroute ships that would come during the hurricane seasons. You had interesting little architectural developments simply because of the area that they lived in. You had the beginnings of insurance schemes. I mean, one of the reasons that some of the southern colonies got a start was because Caribbean colonial planners were tired of just being wiped clean like the hand of God when a hurricane would ravage through sugarcane fields. So they hopped on a ship and set up operations in the southern colonies to grow indigo, rice, tobacco, and so forth.
More stable.
So, but in these early years of the early republic, you would have the federal government crafted 120 some odd disaster-specific pieces of legislation. But what's very important about these, they were extremely limited. They were extremely targeted into direct harm, and the most important element of it was no fault whatsoever of your own. So if for whatever reason there was money outlaid, some particular risky investment decision that you put yourself in harm's way, then you would not be eligible for some grant of aid. And most of the forms of aid in the early national period just related to extensions of the payment of taxes, custom house bonds, and so forth. But still, by and large, people were self-reliant. That was the big message of the day.
So if we bring this to Long Island in the mid-30s, we're heading to 38, how many big hurricanes were there like that made an impact before 38? Was it something that they had to deal with before in terms of large-scale destruction? Or?
Well, the problem with disasters for a particular subculture of a community to be sufficiently robust and on alert, you have to have what's called a disaster subculture. And that requires that you have a particular event which is of such severity and happens with such frequency that it doesn't sort of fade away from one generation to the next. And unfortunately, in the case of Long Island, the frequency that we get those really sharp storms is so far apart that people's collective memory just sort of forgets about them. Now, we have a subculture that is very aware of erosions, driving storms, winter storms, nor'easters, and things of that nature. And in particular, some of the people that I interviewed on the east end of Long Island, they were more acutely aware than you might find of people who were towards the middle of the island or in Queens or Brooklyn. Furthermore, during the 1930s, and as I document in my manuscript, that when the national offices of the Red Cross arrived on the scene in the wake of the hurricane of 38, they were shocked at how shoddily run and ill-prepared Long Island was. Now, there was a big boost that happened during the great roll calls after World War I. But the big thing that really made southern New England, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and interior portions of upstate New York much more resilient was during 35 and 36, you had a series of floods, which was sort of a shakeout and great drill for Red Cross chapters to get activated, to dust off some of their old disaster relief manuals, to see how people work in an active disaster situation. Long Island didn't face that. So when the storm happened, nobody really knew what was happening. Plus, the main Long Island office was run by a fellow whose main office was in Brooklyn. I mean, they had to get in cars, and on the front page of the New York Times, you had to share the hurricane of 38 with Hitler going into the Sudetenland. And everybody was sort of like, hey, what's going on Long Island? It really blew here last night, but aside from some chicken coops in the Pelham section of the Bronx and some flooding in some of the subways, they really didn't get it that bad. And remember, when a hurricane goes up the coast, it's going in a counterclockwise direction. So it's always going to be the east of Long Island that gets it harder hit than the west, which is towards the city. So, and when they finally did their fact-finding mission, which was just a bunch of people in a couple cars, and they started seeing who was hard hit, and the worst of the destruction was out in West Hampton Beach and Montauk, which if you're driving from Brooklyn and there are trees down all over the place, you can imagine that took a while to get to and understand exactly what was happening. So the Red Cross, it required a lot of, and that was one of the boons of the Red Cross organization, because they were able to shift men, material, and supplies from the national offices in Washington, D.C. and other areas of New England to buttress the inconsistent and ill-prepared nature of the Long Island Red Cross chapters.
So let's just go through the basics of the event, and then we'll talk about the aftermath and
Sure.
the relief effort. So I believe it was a Wednesday, September 21st, 1938.
Yes.
No real warning.
Well, once again, it's like, look at what we have today that we take for granted. We have Hurricane Hunter Air Force airplanes. We have drones. We have satellites. But way back when, we relied on a series of ship and land-based telegraphy, right? People sending radio messages, people reporting last reported, sighting, and they would give you a line of longitude and latitude. The problem is that the Hurricane of 38 still ranks as having one of the fastest track speeds on record. People went to sleep September 20th, and it was somewhere east of Florida, right? And then what happens in the middle of the night? What happens in the middle of the night is it makes a hard right, and it goes north at almost 70 miles an hour. So if you've ever driven from New York to Florida, you can do that in 24 hours flat to Miami. And that's what happened. And people didn't know where it was. So,
Well, and so that's another thing. So in terms of the modern infrastructure, it was not named. We were not naming hurricanes back then.
Correct.
And
yes.
there was no scale. So it was not you can't say category 1, 2, or 3. And so West Hampton Beach is sort of where it came ashore. It
was just east of where the eye wall hit, so it received its full force right there. And of course, Montauk got a full arm going right into it.
So it moves through pretty quickly. It moves up. We'll say it moves up through New England, so it's very well known and well documented. It's a New England event as well.
Yes.
So in that immediate aftermath, or as it was happening, can you talk a little bit about the Red Cross office in Brooklyn? So how did forces start mobilizing as they became aware of the extent of the damage or the potential damage that was happening?
Well, the very next day, they head off in cars from the Brooklyn office. Everybody fans out. And that wasn't the only fact-finding mission you had. You also had diocese efforts by the Episcopalian Church. They also sent people to take a tally of what parishes would need aid as well. So all of the Red Cross officers go out, they see what people needed. Some of the chapters in particular, and this sort of goes to the sort of stubborn nature, and I don't mean that in a bad way at all, but remember, the Red Cross doesn't just provide aid, but they're sort of a political organization as well, and they rely on, of course, individual donations. While they did receive infusions of cash from the federal government to help with Storm XYZ, they relied on their day-to-day activities through members' donations. So cars from some of the more wealthy New York, Manhattan chapters got in their cars, went out to Montauk. Now, Montauk was populated by, a bunch of hardscrabble farmers and fishermen. And here come these Red Crossers in their Lincolns and Cadillacs and Rolls Royces, and they go into one of Carl Smith's hotels, which was opened up to take some of the people who were homeless as a result of the hurricane, and they come in and they try to unfurl Red Cross banners, and some of the fishermen just took the banners down, escorted them out, and said, "We're doing fine on our own. Don't think you're just going to jet in here, take all the accolades and the praise."
Raise your flag.
Yeah. So there was a little bit of tension that had to do with some of the Red Cross workers. And of course, people were very proud as well. There was a reconfiguring of the mind that had to do with giving of a Red Cross grant. People on the Eastern Forks of Long Island were proud to say that I got through the Great Depression without one penny of money from the federal government. And just reconfiguring people to say, "You mean you're going to give me this grant and there's no strings attached?" And even then, people in many cases didn't want to take the aid. Now, of course, many people just needed it so bad. Their fishing boats were just wrecked, or they were thrown on land, props damaged, boards needed to be repaired. A lot of people had summer cottages that they would rent out. Remember, Long Island was a burgeoning tourist industry, and you see this a lot in West Hampton Beach. The old model was they'd have a big house they'd live in for 8 months out of the year, and then in the back corner of the property there'd be a modest little shack. So they would rent out their big house during the summer. The homeowners would live in the back shack, and they would get rent from this house, which would carry them through the whole year. People such as those, they needed that little infusion of cash. But it was a hard sell for people to take those monies,
Right. Well, when you say going back to the earlier thinking of early America, that pluck and individualism, I guess it was. Did they look at it as a sign of weakness, taking the money, or was it just sort of a point of pride that they could do it themselves? Or
yeah, it definitely was a point of pride, and it was just, this was the ethos of that social strata of society and you have to remember that back then you definitely get less of that vibe today, but when you would go along the northern and southern spines of eastern Long Island, it was very much like hopping on lily pads. When I worked and lived in Texas, you get that sense that even though you're surrounded by all this land, is that the towns of Texas were almost like they would be this great gulf, almost like going across water to islands of populations. And these people lived very insular, distinct lives. They very much relied on their own handiwork, their own fortitude in farming the land and in farming the sea. They were very happy to say that even during the Depression, they didn't want for anything because they lived with such bounty on the sea. I mean, the seas were overflowing with whatever you wanted today. I mean, nowadays, you can't fish this. This has to be a certain length here. You can't do these beds here. Stuff was overflowing back then.
There's a lot of stories, and it's a multifaceted relief effort. But what were some of the major things that had to happen? We talked about the fishermen in Montauk, so they needed their boats restored and their livelihood and that kind of thing. But throughout the rest of the South Fork, what were the main things that people were worried about taking care of in that immediate aftermath?
In the immediate aftermath, people just there were a lot of people that needed to be rescued, of course, on the barrier beach you have in the stretch from Jones to Captree Barrier Island and the Fire Island going out east in that direction. So the local Coast Guard stations were activated, and they rescued some people who were there, giving them food, giving them blankets, setting up local stations, sometimes in the basement of the town hall or a local church. And then the Red Cross had to have a handle on exactly who was deserving of need. So if you were of a particular social strata, you would immediately rely on yourself. But then if you were judged to be deserving of a particular type of aid, it would very much be targeted to the particular harm that befell you. So if you had two houses, they were both wrecked, we wouldn't repair both, but we will repair your one main property. Or if you have a second house that's used for income of renting it out, then of course we will help you prepare it. The Red Cross also they didn't want to lift anybody above their existing social station in life. So if they were found to be deserving of aid they actually had a low, medium, and high chart that would be used for home furnishings.
So what quality of furniture you'd replace?
Exactly. So if you were lived in a very modest shack, you would have a very simple pine table and chairs. Moving up the ladder, it might be a little bit more ornate, you know?
And I don't know if you saw this play out, but would you think the people that had the means, they wouldn't want to take that check from the Red Cross either? They would say, no, I'm wealthy enough. Or was there the fear that people were sort of dipping into funds that they didn't need and kind of profiting off of that?
In my research didn't indicate that they would be people in higher social strata who were trying to game the system, but there were instances of people who were trying to maybe double dip. So, because remember, you have not only the Red Cross program going on, but you have Farm Securities Administration, you have the Federal Housing Authority, and a raft of other New Deal programs. So even though we're in the late 30s, the amount of money that the federal government had outlaid is really starting to catch up with itself, and they realize they have to pare back those programs. Okay. Plus, you have, of course, Republicans are starting going, who's going to pay this bill already? But by this period of time, and this is where we can talk about the New Deal now as well, is the New Deal was trying to be legally justified. Remember, the New Deal had to do with environmental calamity. So the whole notion was to help people through the New Deal because this happened through no fault of their own. And how they bridge that gulf between a disaster being no fault of your own and will help you, to an economic catastrophe being no fault of your own. That was the legal justification. The federal government tried to say, look, for years we've been doing modest pieces of legislation and aid, trying to help people who, through no fault of their own, a fire, flood, hurricane, or some other tragedy befell them, and we've extended aid to them. The same conditions apply here. Here are little people. They were not banks making risky loans or any of that other fiscal shenanigans that were going on. They are deserving of aid as well.
So to stick on the New Deal,
yes.
Where was the New Deal by 38? Was it sort of, you were saying that the spending was sort of catching up, or so in terms of their activities and also the robustness of it and the total arc of the New Deal in the late 30s when the hurricane hit, sort of what was the state of?
Well, the New Deal wasn't as amply funded as it was during the first term of office of FDR, to be sure. However, what you had happened in 1936, I believe, 36, 37, was the great Mississippi River Valley floods. And the federal government creates the DRC, the Disaster Relief Commission, which was the only New Deal agency created specifically with disaster relief in mind. And going through the Disaster Relief Commission records, and I was probably the first person to ever look at them. They just took off the plastic. They had what I term archival anthrax on them, and you probably know what I'm talking about, that sort of heavy, thick layer of dust I'm
sitting there.
Exactly. And it was a multi-volume bunch of big ledgers, and they extended loans to churches, small businesses, fishermen, and individuals to repair, rejuvenate, to pick themselves up after the Mississippi Valley floods. This program is just about to close and unwind, and then the 38 hurricane happens in New England, and they say, whoa, we got to ramp this up. So they juiced it with a little bit more money, and they opened a lot of the aid available to people on Long Island and the rest of New England. So that was another form of aid in the New Deal quiver that they could offer people. And I mean, you had Federal Surplus Commodities Corporation. They were not only giving food to people, but after the hurricane, of course, this is September. This is harvest time. And what did it do? It knocked every crop down on the ground. So there's a lot of crops that are just sitting there that are unmarketable, but are still nevertheless good for food. They were bought out by the FSCC and then given to people. And a variety. Civilian Conservation Corps, you have people who are carting away debris, opening fire lanes, clearing the roads. working alongside people from the state level government and Suffolk County itself.
So how did the coordination? So it sounds like a lot of people on the ground, either local or coming in from other agencies. Was it a logistical nightmare, or how did that play out?
You don't see a lot of those sort of wrangling that you might go on simply because of capabilities, while this period of time was curious because you had so many different pieces working together. But nevertheless, it still was a shadow of what you might see today with big earth-moving equipment, National Guard troops. And I mean, there are so many organizations, from individual women who might be sewing T-shirts for people or having a soup can drive, all the way up to Doctors Without Borders and Habitat for Humanity and stuff like that. So the Red Cross was sort of the titular head of all of that. They wanted to be aware, but then the New Deal was as well. However, then when you have issues as, of course, states' rights and stuff like that, I mean, the federal government is coming into a particular locality, they would talk to local authorities. So they would talk with the Suffolk County Highway Department. They would talk to the Suffolk County Welfare Department. This is what we're doing. This is where we could use you. And then when you have, for instance, the case of like Shelter Island, of course, still to this day, there always were efforts to put a bridge across it, never did. So, and their indigenous capabilities on the island were nil. There was down trees all over the place, and they got a grant for troops of New Dealers to go across the bridge and basically clean up the entire island. So people were in sight of one another and would talk to one another, but it was nowhere near the level of coordination, and like you would see a giant war room that you do today. You just didn't have anything like that. But people were aware and respectful of all the constituent agencies that were around them.
So one thing I wanted, this is a good portion of your dissertation too, and it gets to another level of relief efforts. And you mentioned the diocese, so the church efforts.
Yes.
And some specific churches that we can bring into this. But do you want to start us talking about like some of the churches that were hit and how those parishes or dioceses responded?
Okay, as far as diocesan efforts, I don't claim to know the history of a lot of denominations. I was lucky enough to find the Episcopalian diocese disaster relief efforts to chart their churches that were on the east end of Long Island. And in their travels to all of their churches, they also stopped by neighboring parishes that while they weren't within their diocese, they nevertheless would check up and see how they're doing. I mean, there were a lot of independent parishes on the east end of Long Island. So they made trips to, now St. Andrew's Dune Church, for instance, was just, that was just hammered.
That was in Southampton.
Yeah, that was hammered by the storm, and they weren't part of the diocese. They were an independent church. They were set up by a very wealthy flock at the period of time, so they had the ability to restore the church themselves. We do know some of the debates because it's charted in a lot of the local newspapers. Okay. And, you know, there were a lot of frank discussions on what went on. The Dune Church had always had a very curious connection. I mean, it's right on the dunes. If you've ever been there, it's got Lake Agawam to the north, and it's got the Atlantic to the south. And it's probably one of the most curious churches simply because it wasn't a church at all. It was a former life-saving and aid station that was owned by the federal government. The federal government wanted to get rid of it. And one of the members of the community purchased it from the federal government and turned it into a church. So it had always had this life-saving ability and sort of ethos that was cooked into it. And that church was right on the sand that had witnessed so many ships that had crashed to shore. You had a bunch of British sloops, freighters. Shinnecock Indians went down on the Great Circassian that went down, and you lost dozens of Aboriginal tribe members. So there was a real demonstrable connection with that church and the environment and the shore. And the members, of course, since cost was not an issue, they decided to rebuild it just as they did before. And they had a lot of donation drives, memorial bequests. Wealthy members would contract with Louis Comfort Tiffany to design some of the windows, and strewn across the grounds of the Dune Church are, an anchor from a ship that went down and a blubber pot that used to be used from whales that they caught. So, and if you go there today, it's an absolutely beautiful church. I mean, it's quite robust. Then, let's say going over to the Shinnecock Church, that which is the Shinnecock Church today is not part of what existed before. The Shinnecock Church drifted away in Shinnecock Bay. It got completely carried over and away. So they needed a new church. Now, they had always been, I believe it's the Southampton, is it the First Presbyterian or Episcopal? I forget. But they were, since the 1600s, they had appointed what's known as an overseer or an undertaker. Not to be confused with measuring your coffin. But they would appoint somebody within the congregation, the minister themselves, who would look after the tribe members themselves. And a lot of them had pledged their commitment to Jesus Christ and so forth. That's why they had the church there, which also doubled as a community house. So fast forward, after the storm took, there were memorial drives, the church took donations themselves, and the Indians themselves organized a powwow. They had a lot of Aboriginal events, which sort of deserves a bit of an asterisk because it was the feeling of the greater Indian tribes of New York State that not an ounce of Indian blood on Long Island actually survived.
Yeah, that's a whole nefarious background to this, like the pureness of the blood. And I think there are only 200 people you document living on the Shinnecock Neck at that point, or the population was a pretty small base. It
was a very small and discrete population, and actually, if you see the powwow itself, it really wasn't a Shinnecock event, more so than an omnibus of various tribes lending elements to the goings-on. It was sort of like a I don't want to say whitewashed powwow, but it was done more so to deliver donations for the rebuilding of the church.
So it's sort of an all-star team of different tribes coming in from different parts of the...
Exactly. It was a grander celebration of Indianness itself.
Did you see more, I know you concentrate a lot on the Shinnecock Church, but in terms of the aid they received and the federal response and maybe the Red Cross in that area, did you see anything particular about how they interacted with these different aid groups, or did they benefit just as much as any other population out there?
Well, Dr. J. Percival Ugot, and he had a church, I believe, on Shelter Island at the time, and he was appointed as the head of the Shinnecock Church Restoration Campaign. So he would liaise with various agencies. They got some funds from outside organizations, but most of it was through donations from churches, from powwow events, and from the local community. And if you look at the Shinnecock Church today, I mean, it's not a grand church with a mammoth steeple as in the tradition of, those rather ornate ones that you would find on the North Fork or in Sag Harbor, for instance. It was a very practical one that had dual uses.
I just wanted to mention Sag Harbor. Two things about that. One is, as I was reading your account, it struck me that these churches with their steeples were probably some of, if not the tallest structures on the island at this point.
They were. As a matter of fact, the old Whalers Church until 1938, it was sort of one of those cardinal points that mariners would use to come back home. I mean, during the halcyon days of the whaling community, people would steer by that.
Yeah, and I was out there, and you have a great picture. This is what came home to me. So the Sag Harbor, the church, Old Whalers Church, is sort of in the Egyptian style, so it's kind of a boxy church, and it's maybe 3-4 stories tall, but I had never seen a picture of the spire. I knew the story that it got blown down, but the picture you have in the book, the spire,
it's so over the top,
taller than the church itself.
Yes, and it just has so many elements. I mean, what they call the neo-Egyptian revivalist style. It was just so over the top, like what looks like whale spades. In the original design, those were supposed to be asps' heads.
So that blew down because obviously it was
Yes.
vulnerable because it was like 300 feet tall or 150.
And that relief effort actually is one of the longest lasting one that still goes forward to today, because they initially wanted to have a relief drive to rebuild it. Then they tried again in another decade, and it keeps popping up, and it popped up most recently, maybe about 10 or so years ago. A lot of the local leaders said, hey, why don't you, because cell companies will often try to hide their dishes and stuff inside existing structures. So it's a win-win. We get our cell phone service, we're giving money to the community, but it's being hidden inside of a structure that looks palatable as opposed to a pole with, yeah. So unfortunately, the cost of rebuilding the steeple, putting dishes inside of that structure would have been cost prohibitive.
So where do you see, what's the big picture takeaway of what this hurricane relief effort led to or paved the way to do? And if you want to sort of bring us up into the modern disaster relief universe.
Well, why this period of time was very interesting, and I'm reluctant to say inflection point or watershed moment, because historians are always trying to say that their particular project is, this was a critical moment, this was a critical person or era or age. And you get the sense that, wow, it's like every moment in time is something very important. But you see a bunch of unique players finally operating together, where in the colonial days, you just did not have any of the big players. You didn't have a Red Cross. Churches gave ecumenical relief. You had insurance schemes, but those were only available to just giant corporations like the Dutch East India Trading Company or giant planters. So, and then you had big gaps in coverage. Fast forward to this period of time, you have all of these various organizations, from the very big to the very small, operating together and giving what I term the modern disaster relief style. So you have big transnational organizations such as the Red Cross. You still have the Red Cross today. Habitat for Humanity, as I mentioned, Doctors Without Borders, and a raft of others that if you've ever looked at some big disaster that happens across the globe, they will come in. Then you have whatever particular nation you're in has its own domestic relief capacity. Then you will have states. Then you will have municipalities. Then you will have churches, community organizations, and of course the individual. And now the big player is, what you didn't have before, is sort of private enterprise disaster relief too. I mean, leveraging the great logistical support and material resources of Home Depots and Lowe's, Budweiser. They can instantly transform their lines that made cans of beer into bottles of water. I mean, this offers us such a diverse array of resources that, once again, now the problem is it's almost a problem of, whereas in years past it might have been a problem of poverty, not having the resources. Now it's something in disaster relief that they call convergence. Whenever a disaster happens, you have so many people and material flooding an area that it's like we don't need 5 train cars of blankets and bare aspirin.
Stop sending socks.
Yeah, that's why in modern disasters, a lot of people will just say, just give your money to a notable, give it to the Red Cross, give it to the Salvation Army, and they will put the money to where it's needed. So nowadays, what we have is hierarchical, we have coordination. Now, when municipalities and localities cease to be able to handle a disaster, what happens is triggers fall up. So if a locality can't handle a particular thing, you fall up. Then it's the county. County can't handle it, fall up to the state, and so on and so forth. Then you'll have all of these things working together. And modern, Suffolk County, New York City, New York State all have emergency management departments now. And they're big. I don't know if you've ever seen one of the centers that they have are Sometimes these are multi-use facilities that will be used, for instance, by cops if they're looking for a serial killer or if there's a terrorist event. And they will be banks of phones, computer monitors, and everything will be linked in so everybody can liaise with one another. Everybody knows that we don't need the 5 same agencies clearing the same highway. Resources will be shifted to where they're needed. You can see trouble spots and lack of capacity in a certain area. Things can be shifted around. So the big story is now great amount of material and capacity, and of course the ability to direct it in a very cognizable way.
My bigger question is about Long Island history, and so where do you feel that should be in the study of history or in terms of people's awareness of it? Like what if you, I don't know if you would make this case, but if you were to make the case for the importance of Long Island history as its own subject as opposed to New York City history or state history, what's to you the most salient point to say why should we be studying?
Well, the knee-jerk reaction is to look at Long Island sort of as just an afterthought or an appendage to what goes on in New York City. It's just sort of that stuff east of New York City that a lot of people look at. But I believe it was Long Island historian Roger Wunderlich who posited the Long Island is America thesis. And he suggested that if you look at what goes on Long Island, not only is it sort of a petri dish of an experimentation of larger trends that emerge in greater Long Island society, but Long Island is also a mirror for what goes on. So what I saw on Long Island, I also did a lot of research in Connecticut and Rhode Island, and I was able to briefly survey, and then when I went to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., what went on in Long Island very much was a part of what went on in other areas. It wasn't like things were totally different. I mean, I mentioned that one area with the capabilities of the Red Cross, for instance, was different on Long Island. But a lot of the lessons are transferable wholesale. I mean, you can get a lot. Certainly, William Levitt, right? The rise of Levittown that went on, for instance, that was something which spearheaded the direction of suburbia itself. And here we have playing out during the hurricane of 38, sort of this interesting experiment in disaster relief, which sort of prefigured the direction that modern disaster relief would take. So as a historian, you constantly have to pull the leash back on in yourself and be honest with the material and not be prone to making grandiose claims or reading too much into the limited amount of information you have. But at the same time, you have to realize that Long Island is more than a backwater. It's more than just this sort of appendage that hangs off of New York City. So I would say there's great potency in the historical record for what went on in Long Island.
Is there anything about the disaster research you did or the points you want to make that we didn't get to as we were talking?
Merely that we are disaster. I mean, we are integral to the shape and form that disaster assumes. Disaster is not just that hammer blow of that event. That's a triggering mechanism. And we shape that disaster by decisions we make before it even darkens our doorstep, whether through zoning laws, insurance schemes. I mean, if you look at the federal government, National Flood Insurance Program, the Army Corps of Engineers, they are artificially pumping and priming natural worlds and fiscal systems in such a way that they might be out of step with natural risks that would find themselves a different balance, right, if the federal government did not intervene, So should the federal government be backstopping and making abnormally low insurance schemes across the entire South Shore of Long Island, right? I mean, are we going to keep rebuilding New Orleans every couple decades or so, right? I mean, and so to wade into these issues of nature finds a dynamic solution to risks in a given environment. Nature finds a solution on its own to us living within a particular space. And if we aren't careful about where we live, how we live, thinking what type of lifestyle that we think we're entitled to, one of those left hands of nature is going to come by and remind us again, you know? And so we have to be prepared for that. We have to be prepared for that.
And thank you again to Jonathan. You will find links to related resources as well as ways to get in touch with him. That's at longislandhistoryproject.org. And we're just about to the end of the year, so we've got one more episode. We hope you've been enjoying all the pieces of Long Island history we've been bringing you. If you have any of your own stories to tell, research you've done, or stories from your own history of Long Island, drop us a line at longislandhistoryproject@gmail.com. We're putting together episodes for next year. Always happy to talk to people. And all we ask beyond that is that you help us spread the word that there is a podcast out there dedicated to Long Island history. Our outro music is Capering by the Blue Dot Sessions. That's used under an Attribution 4.0 international license. That's it for the penultimate episode. As always, thank you for listening.